This reflection is based on Mark chapter 12, verses 28 to 34. The setting of this passage is that Jesus has now entered Jerusalem and he knows that these are his last days. He rode into Jerusalem on a donkey and the people cheered him, and of course that set his opponents a bit on edge. But then his next act got them really riled up because he went into the temple. And in the temple there were people selling animals for sacrifice and people changing the local money for temple money so they could pay the temple taxes. Trouble is, it was totally corrupt. It was all about money making. And so Jesus went in and he just tipped over the tables of the money changers and he drove the people selling animals out. And he says this, he says, "Isn't it written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of robbers." So naturally he drew some attention from the religious leaders, and they came to confront him, ask him, by what authority do you think you are going to do this? But they were afraid to do anything to Jesus because the people thought he was wonderful. So the next chapter, they come up with a series of questions where they hoped they would trap Jesus into making an answer that would then give them the opportunity to execute him because he's tripped himself up on the answer. And the interesting thing is that here you start to get people who hated each other banding together to try and trip Jesus up. And the first confrontation came from the Pharisees and the Herodians. Now, the Pharisees hated the Herodians because the Herodians were in collaboration with Rome, and the Pharisees just hated that. They were totally anti-Rome. And the question they came up with was, who do we pay taxes to? Is it right to pay tax to Caesar or not? And Jesus very simply confronted it and says, well, you give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and you give to God what belongs to God. And they really didn't have an answer to that and went away with their tail between their legs. So the next group to try were the Sadducees. Now these were the wealthy and ruling elite. They were opposed to the Pharisees. They believed that the only laws were the ones that were written in the first 5 books of the Bible, whereas the Pharisees had all this oral tradition that they adhered to. And also the Sadducees did not believe in anything supernatural, and certainly not in a resurrection. So they came up with a question which they thought would just show how ridiculous the idea of resurrection was. They used a Jewish custom that if a man was married and he died before he had children, then his brother was to marry the widow and give children to the brother. And so they come up with this scenario where this happens, man marries, he dies before there are any children, his brother marries the widow, but he dies before there are any children, and goes on right through 7 brothers. And then they say, well, whose wife is she going to be in the resurrection? Thinking it's absolutely ridiculous. But of course Jesus points out there's no such thing as marriage in the life after this life. So those 2 groups have been defeated. They just haven't been able to trick Jesus with their questions. And then you hear about this scribe who comes along and asks the question, and it's a little bit like he's been sitting back and watching, and then he comes forward and he asks this one question. But his question seems to be a genuine one. What's the most important commandment? Jesus quoted Deuteronomy 6:5. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength." And then he added a second one, and that's from Leviticus 19:18. "Love your neighbour as yourself." And he added, "There is no greater commandment than these." And the scribe replied, "These commandments are more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." And you could just about see Jesus smile. And his reply, if I put it in my words, was something like, "Yeah, man, you got it." If we obey these 2 commands, then all the others will follow automatically. We're called to love God with everything we are and everything that we have. Now, love isn't just about an emotional feeling. It's talking about unwavering commitment. In the marriage service, we ask the bride and groom to make a statement of their intention. What are they here for? And it's put in these words: will you give yourself to whoever to be your husband, wife? Will you love him, comfort him, honour and protect him, and so on? It doesn't say, do you love him? It said, will you? So it isn't asking how you feel. It's asking about your commitment. Will you commit yourself to loving? And this is what God's calling us to do. He wants us to be committed in all we do. Yes, it certainly helps to have the feelings of love, and that certainly helps us in our commitment. But what God asks is an unwavering commitment to him. Now, the command to love neighbour, again, is not about feelings of love towards them, but about caring for their needs. And if we truly love God, then love for neighbour will actually follow. It comes much more naturally. We're called to see them as God sees them. And we know that God loves them just as much as he loves us. So it affects our way in which we're going to love our neighbour, because loving them will also include sharing our love of Jesus with them, not just in making sure they have all the material goods that they need. We know that God loves us, and we want them to experience the love that we have too. There was a story a few weeks ago where it seems to show that the disciples had, more love for themselves than they did for Jesus, because Jesus had just said to them, look, I'm going to be arrested, I'll be mocked, I'll be spat on, I'll be put to death. And what do they ask? Oh, we'd like the seats of honour in your kingdom. It's this lone scribe who asked Jesus what the greatest commandment was. And he's the one who seems to get what discipleship is all about.